part of the background of this course is what's been happening in the world. It's easy for us to lose our faith in humanity, our faith in the divine, or our faith in progress because of what's been happening in the world. I'm thinking of things like Israel and Hamas, and Ukraine and Russia, and threat of civil war south of the border, divisiveness, lots of developments that are very, frightening. Environmental things, justice-oriented things. So, plus, I've always been interested in justice. My background is in philosophy, religion, history, comparative ethics. So I've tried to build a bridge between some of my old interests and this new big topic for me, justice, looking at it very comparatively. I was telling Rachel that I've sort of researched this like a journalist. It's not as if I have a degree in law or jurisprudence or any. It's that I've developed interest in justice, looked at, from many different perspectives. Some of you have seen me lead classes before, and I tend to, take a very big picture approach. We look at different cultures, with different religions, different historical periods. I'm always trying to overcome Eurocentrism, looking at things from a very Western point of view. I'm also very interested in social justice and things like refugee work, restorative justice, peace work, earth care. So justice we'll look at in a very broad way. I came to Canada 37 years ago, half my life ago, and I did that because it looked like in Canada you could get a better sense of the world community, multicultural diversity, people from different religious and ideological backgrounds. I've been a Unitarian minister for 25 years, and over the last 25 years, after I was a Unitarian minister, I've been teaching comparative religion courses and world history courses, things like science and spirituality, comparative ethics, and that sort of thing. So justice has been lurking in the background of my interests a long, long time. So I'm delighted that enough people were interested in taking a course like this, and I'm eager to see what you'll bring to the table. That's a quick introduction about me. This course in particular, today we're looking at the whole sweep through the slideshow, and I want to introduce some terms that are important, like justice and law. I tend to think that knowledge is a moving target. So whenever I offer a definition, it doesn't mean like I think that's all that needs to be said about something. We have many different angles on things, and knowledge is growing. And each of you is a knowledge base and an experience base of a certain kind. And I'm hoping you'll bring your experience and knowledge and wisdom to the table. So I'm seeing this as a series of discussions with little mini lecturettes that describe some topic areas for possible investigation and exploring. So today we're introducing the field as a whole, looking at terms and some of the historical threats to justice, the terms like genocide, for example. And then next week, we'll look at indigenous and ancient views of justice. The goal will be to overcome Eurocentrism. So sessions 2, 3, and 4 are giant opportunities to look at justice from a very different point of view, an indigenous and ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia point of view. In the third session, we go to South Asia or India and look at justice from Hindu and Buddhist and Jain perspectives, etc. And China too. That's going to be a big session, session 3, looking at Chinese and Indian views of law and justice and social order. And then the following one, the fourth session, is again another chance to overcome Eurocentrism, looking at justice from an ancient Persian or Zoroastrian point of view and an Islamic point of view. So these will bring different angles to the table, looking at justice as a phenomenon for the world community. And then in the fifth session, we're turned back to the West. We'll look at, Jewish, Christian, Greek contributions to the concept of justice. In the sixth session, we look at international law, which is basically how law developed during the colonial era, you might say. You know, Europe tended to dominate the world from the 16th century on, and concepts of international law developed. We'll look at that history. In the seventh session, we'll look at the Baha'i frame of reference regarding justice and world order. And in the last session, we'll look at current efforts to visualize global justice. And we're going to look a lot at earth care in that session, the history of environmentalism, and how justice seems to require us to include all living things and the earth itself. Okay, so it's a very broad picture that we're trying to look at. I want to mention on the first page of the handout, I think you've been sent a slideshow and a 4-page sort of outline of the whole course showing the sessions. And there's a handout for today, about 10 pages. That first page, we're not going to look at every word. Don't worry about it. This is all food for thought. But on the first page, I mentioned possible motivations for taking a course like this. I just want to look at that. Some people may be hoping to restore their faith in humanity and progress despite today's accelerating injustices. You might want to craft a fair view of the global challenges and opportunities that we face. You might be interested in big picture surveys, and certainly that's what this is, a big picture survey. You might want to overcome perplexity about the nature of justice, try to get a handle on it, given socioeconomic and political dimensions. You may be wondering how to integrate the great diversity we have in the world, both ethnoculturally and in terms of biodiversity. How do we make a justice system that includes all? You may be trying to sort out different dimensions of justice, the spiritual dimension, environmental dimension, or the political and ethical and social dimensions. And finally, you might be wondering, what can you do to contribute to a more just world? That question probably is lurking in the back of our minds all the time. What can we do to make a difference? So a course like this, and especially given the contributions of all of you as participants, might give us ideas what we can specifically do. Also on the first page, I mentioned something I call hypotheses on the origin and destiny of justice concepts. Basically, what I have come to believe is the highest concepts of justice have come from religion. This might be a controversial notion to you, but I think I can show you that religions in their older or pure forms taught justice. And in fact, when we study the history of justice, we're studying the history of religious concepts. I'm not saying religions have followed their own concepts of justice. They certainly taught them, right? And so if we want to look at higher notions of justice, we end up looking at what religion said justice is. Okay, that's a quick interview or overview. I wonder if we can see the slideshow. There's 25 slides, and we'll go through that in 25 minutes. Then I'd like each of you to sort of introduce yourself briefly, you know, your name and where you live and why you wanted to take a course like this. Okay, so Rachel, yeah, if you can show that first slide. Okay, we can almost see that whole slide. Maybe it can be scrolled down a little bit. Anyway, so here I'm at, yeah, there you go. I'm asking the big question. How have humanity's concepts of justice evolved through the ages? What elements of these concepts are shared in common? Do we see any progress when we study justice in the world? And what does justice mean to you in particular? And I have here some initial working terms. A proposed definition of justice, a societal ideal allowing for wide participation, basic rights, basic duties, encouraging cooperation, optimal degrees of freedom and equality, appropriate rewards and punishments, all the while seeking restoration, virtuous conduct, and a flourishing society. So that's an attempt at what is justice. What are some of the areas and concepts of it? Law is a body of enacted rules that's expected to bring about justice. So law and justice are defined in terms of each other. Jurisprudence is the philosophy of law, the practical wisdom about the law, applying it according to sound theoretical principles of justice. And equity means hedging on strict application of law so that you can bring about fairness and justice. Sometimes you have to modify laws to respond appropriately to particular individuals in particular situations. Okay, let's look at the next slide. And this was the hypothesis of the course, that religions historically have taught justice, but of course, humanity has fallen very far short. From my study, I see that religions in their pure or earlier forms expect rulers to promote justice and the common good. Divine law or providence ultimately controls the destinies of nations, empires, and civilizations. This is what religions teach. I'm not saying you have to believe this. This is what religions teach. They also teach that prophets and reformers confront depraved societies and corrupt religions with healing and transformational initiatives. I think religions also teach that every person, every citizen is gifted with choice and responsibility and is expected to respect the law and rightly guided authorities or to receive fair punishment. Religions also teach that the divine realm gives prosperity to peoples and nations that promote justice. So justice is a very important notion in terms of what the world religions have offered. And of course, I'm a student of history, and I know that religions have gotten corrupted and fallen short of what their original high ideals are. But we're studying the highest ideals of religion, so, of justice, so we have to look at what religion has said about them. All right, let's look at slide 3. And here I'm pointing to, ancient indigenous tradition that believed in something like a world sacred tree. The quote from Black Elk, "One mighty flowering tree shelters all the children of one Mother Earth and one Father Sky." The fruits of that world tree were to show humanity the path or how to live. Indigenous groups have been studied worldwide, and here is something called the Harmony Way, which shows the basic principles of ancient indigenous wisdom. Respect everyone and everything as sacred, seek harmony, increase your friends and family, laugh at yourself, everyone gets a say, speak from your heart, look forward by looking back, work hard but rest well, share what you have, and we are all related. So those are things held in common to indigenous Christians throughout the world, and they say a lot about justice. Okay, let's look at 4. Slide 4 looks at Africa and the concept of Ubuntu. I think Nelson Mandela is the one that brought this onto the map of humanity, but this goes back very, very far, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The idea here is that we owe everything to the tribe. I am because we are. A person is a person through other people. Ubuntu is the sense that the tribe has given you so much that you are ethically and spiritually responsible for the tribe and whatever nurtures the tribe, which means ever widening circles around it. So Ubuntu is a very powerful ethical concept. Okay, let's look at 5. We're marching through history, and I'm going over to India now. 3,500 BCE, that's like 5,500 years ago, there was a notion of artha, or eternal moral law, sanctioned by the high god Varuna, the universal king. About 2,000 years later, Manu's law, was generated, or no, 5,000 years later, yeah. The Dharma Shastra goes back to about 5,000 BC. offering guidance of various kinds, moral codes, rules of caste, consequences of good and bad actions. Then 1500 BC, there was the Mahabharata, the story of ancient India. Look at this rule of law. Ancient India had a hierarchy of judges overseen by the Chief Justice. And here's a specific teaching. A king who swears to provide for and protect the people, yet fails to do so, shall be executed. So this is what the West would call the rule of law, and it's way back 1500 BC. That's 2,700 years earlier than the Magna Carta. Okay, let's look. Slide number 6 goes over to Mesopotamia. There was a concept of universal law. Enlil was the establisher of universal law who held high standards for rulers. 2 law codes came out of ancient Mesopotamia. Ur-Nammu's code spoke about equity in the land, and Hammurabi's code is more well known, set up, to please the sun god or the god of justice, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. That was the rule of law, and also the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Here we're going to ancient Egypt. I find it fascinating that there was a god and goddess that were paired up with the responsibility for justice. Arbiters of justice, truth, and law were Ma'at, a goddess, and Thoth, a god. And they together enjoined the living to make amends with everyone they have ever harmed, so that their journey to the afterlife goes a lot more smoothly. That's a very powerful notion, that we need to sometime in this life, overcome all of the inequities that we're responsible for before we go into the other world. Let's look at slide 8. We're bouncing through history and looking at geography. In ancient China, there was a notion of the mandate of heaven. This is about 4,200 years ago. This means it is divine will that the kings serve the people. Shang-Ti, the Lord of Heaven, who was modeled by sage kings Yao, Shun, and Yu that go back about 4,000 years. Rulers were expected to fulfill the mandate of heaven and bring bounty to the people. Later, about 3,000 years ago, the Zhao dynasty developed a formal legal system, and Confucius, 500 years later, praised the Zhao rulers and emphasized learning from history and experience while observing the mandate of heaven. Another philosopher, Mo Tzu, who was about 100 years after Confucius, said, heaven loves the whole world universally. So the mandate of heaven is the Chinese version of what is called the covenant in the West, or the rule of Dharma in India. Okay, let's look at 9. Slide 9 goes to the Jewish or Mosaic faith. Justice is righteousness before God. Of course, Moses' 10 commandments: have no other gods but God, no graven images, no taking the Lord's name in vain, remembering the Sabbath, honoring parents, no killing, adultery, stealing, bearing false witness, and don't even covet your neighbor's goods. So these were, the foundation of a very elaborate system of law called halakha, Jewish law, the way of going based on Moses' Torah. And it emphasizes the wisdom and the benefit of observing divine law and prescribed rituals. Okay, let's look at the 10th slide, which is a glimpse of ancient Persia. There was a concept of asha about 3,000 years ago, meaning something like righteousness, divine order, or moral order. The prophet of that day said he was revealing what the wise Lord wanted humanity to know. Why the wise Lord was called Ahura Mazda. With wisdom from above, we can overcome the evil spirits. We can cultivate good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. The 2 greatest emperors in the Zoroastrian civilization were Cyrus the Great, who's mentioned in the Bible, and Darius the Great, going back to 540 BCE and 500 BCE. They both had something that today looks like a human rights charter and a Hall of Nations, which looks like a multiculturalism policy. We'll look at that in much more detail later on in the course. Okay, let's look at the 11th slide. Here we look at Buddhism. The Eightfold Path has a lot of implications for building a legal and justice system. Look at the fourth step on the Eightfold Path: right conduct. No killing, stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, or substance abuse. And look at the fifth part of the Eightfold Path: right livelihood. Work only in life-promoting trades. Now, the great king, the Buddhist king Ashoka, is the one who made Buddhist teaching a world religion. So he welcomed Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and skeptics. All could be called children of the king with the right to live happily and attain eternal life. Ashoka set up a system of Dharma officers who investigated whether suffering was being minimized all over India. And there were things chiseled in stone and set about everywhere. For example, I am not satisfied with fulfilling the obligations of the state, for I reckon my work to be for the welfare of the whole world. Ashoka was a truly great Buddhist king who spread Buddhism into Southeast Asia. Okay, let's look at slide 12. Here we come to something called cosmopolitanism, the Greco-Roman concept of justice. And again, I remind you, Greece and Rome didn't completely follow this lofty teaching, but they generated it. And it's the idea, cosmopolitanism is the idea of that we should form a world city. Everyone should be welcome into a world city like Athens or Rome. And you should view all knowledge, belief, tradition, and resources as the common heritage of humanity. Each person has dignity and worth. Even slaves should be able to earn their citizenship. So a world citizen is someone who has a very cosmopolitan concept. And today, cosmopolitanism means something like trying to eliminate prejudices of gender, class, race, nationality, culture, religion, and other beliefs. So you could say this was the official worldview of the Roman Empire. Again, they didn't always follow it. I'm not saying they didn't commit atrocities, but we're looking at the highest concepts offered by various cultures and religions. Okay, let's go to 13, which looks at early Christendom, the concept of justification or righteousness through grace and good works. Jesus spoke about the meek being blessed, those who hunger for righteousness also blessed, the merciful blessed, peacemakers blessed, love one another. And Paul, an early follower of Jesus, said, God made from one blood every nation, implying all the peoples of the world are from one blood. And there was even a Christian just war theory that came through Augustine that proposed that, a war has to be fought for a just cause under a right authority with the right intention, using proportional use of force. That is, non-combatants are immune. So there were concepts of law and justice that were generated from early Christianity. Let's look at another phase of Christianity, slide 14. Christianity split between East and West. So here we're looking at Eastern Christendom. The greatest ruler of Eastern Christendom was Justinian, who took all of Roman law and tempered it with Christian principles. So the Justinian Code was an amazing, 50-volume piece of literature that set up the model for legal systems that would spread throughout Western Asia, Russia, Europe, which in turn influenced legal developments in the Americas and Africa. So the Justinian Code is incredibly important in the history of law and justice. Okay, let's look at slide 15. Islam also contributed to law. And again, this describes the highest concepts in Islam, not what Muslims did in world history, but out of the Quran, you see support for family life, generosity, tolerance, equality, justice, consultative governance, defense of Islam, alleviating suffering, helping the afflicted, extending kindness and charity, women's dignified role. All of that is in the Quran itself. Now, a very sophisticated legal system emerged in the wake of the Quran and the Hadith, which were the sayings or traditions of Muhammad. Four systems of law or Sharia developed, ranging from liberal to ultra-conservative, and I've shown you what parts of the world these systems of justice applied to. And Muhammad also had a just war theory that was way more sophisticated. He forbade violence against civilians, meaning non-combatants, women, children, priests, and rabbis. He forbade initiating aggression. He allowed proportionate defense against attack. He forbade the use of fire in warfare. And he said jihad or justified defense was only declarable by heads of state, and neither civic buildings nor agricultural lands may be destroyed. This is a very lofty concept of a just war. I'm, again, not saying Muslims have followed it, but we're studying the highest concepts of justice, and Islam made a very major contribution. Okay, let's look at slide 16. Well, finally, we get to the Magna Carta. You know, some people in the West think this is where, law really started. That's only 800 years ago. But it is important in the West that, King John made this Charter of English Liberties. In other words, the sovereign was to be subject to the rule of law. And this set up a basis for individual rights in Anglo-American jurisprudence. It even led to things like right to petition, limited restraint, due process, and it was a forerunner of the Parliament. Okay, let's go back. Let's look at slide 17. A little bit after the Magna Carta, over in Mongolia, we have Genghis Khan's Yasa Code, which was believed to be quasi-sacred, and it was rather merciless in its punishment system. The most common form of punishment was decapitation. However, because of the size of the Mongolian Empire, there were a lot of people of different religious backgrounds. So an interesting doctrine of religious freedom was clearly established, addressing indigenous peoples of Asia, Confucians, Taoists, Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims. Religious freedom. So that's the biggest contribution of the Mongolian Yasa Code. Let's look at slide 18. This mentions the Great Law of Peace by Daganoweda, the great peacemaker of the Iroquois Confederacy. We're going to look at this in more detail next session. So here I simply want to read you part of it. He says, this message has three parts. Righteousness means justice. Health means soundness of mind and body. But look at what he says about power. Power means authority, the authority of law and custom, backed by the force necessary to make justice prevail. Power also means religion, for justice enforced is the will of the holder of the heavens and has his sanction. So here we see the idea of a creator or the holder of the heavens being behind justice, being behind religion. This had other implications. Thinking shall replace killing, and there shall be one commonwealth. A lot of lofty ideas came out of the Iroquois Confederacy. All right, let's look at slide 19. This gives us a little glimpse of the Sikh faith, which had a concept of hukam, meaning divine order and will. And look at some of these sayings in the Granth Sahib. None shall cause another pain or injury. all humanity shall live together, live in peace together under a shield of administrative benevolence. Some very lofty concepts were in the Granth Sahib, showing how hukam, or divine order and will, needs to be implemented on earth. Look at some of the last ones here. The world is one great family. It says in Granth Sahib, let all mankind be thy sect. Without selfless service, no objectives are fulfilled. Rulers submitting to democratic ideals will endure, and justice is for kings to observe. Okay, let's look at slide 20. There was a figure, Hugo Grotius. We're going to look at this in more detail in session 6, but he's considered the father of international law. He was in the middle of this conflict called the 30 Years' War in Europe, and realized, oh my goodness, we have there's great damage comes from war, and we need to develop a legal system that will make war itself more just, or will prevent war from happening. So he said some very interesting things. There's a common law among nations which is valid alike for war. He was a theologian as well as a statesman, and so he said natural law and divine law both originate in God. They don't contradict each other. Their principles bind all people and nations regardless of local custom. So we're going to look at Hugo Grotius later when we look at the history of international law. Let's look at slide 21. The French Napoleonic Code. This is the most influential law code in the world right now. 120 nations are profoundly influenced by it. It drew its categories from the Justinian Code. You remember we mentioned the Justinian Code earlier? That was a powerful model. And so what the Napoleon Code is basically an update, a more secular, and you might say rationally consistent version of the Justinian Code, mentioning persons, property, acquisition of property, and civil procedure. It tried to eliminate all religious content. So you could say the Napoleonic Code is colonial justice as it was administered by the great powers in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Okay, let's look at slide 22. The Baha'i faith emerged in the 19th century with a concept of the most great justice, which was necessary to bring about world order, world unity, and world peace. I'm reading some of these quotes. Baha'i writings teach the world is but one country and mankind its citizens. Take counsel together. Let your concern be only for that which profits all mankind. Justice is not limited. It is a universal quality. The rights of all must be considered. And then there's the highest body in the Baha'i faith is called the Universal House of Justice, and it seeks universal participation of humanity in the building of a just, unified, and ever-advancing civilization. So in session 7, we'll look at this Baha'i faith contribution to justice and world order in more detail. Okay, let's look at slide 23. I think this has a quote or two from the Baha'i writings. Let me read the first one. Justice is not limited. It is a universal quality. Its operation must be carried out in all classes, from the highest to the lowest. Justice must be sacred, and the rights of all people must be considered. And here you have the golden rule. Desire for others only that which you desire for yourselves. Then shall we rejoice in the sun of justice, which shines from the horizon of God. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Only a few left, and then I'm eager for you to introduce yourselves. You know, since 1950, we've had something called restorative justice. But restorative justice harkens back to the ancient forms of indigenous justice. Specifically, Mennonites bumped into the Maori of New Zealand and found that they had this very well-developed system called utu, or reciprocation, balancing, and restoration. Howard Zehr, who wrote the big book of restorative justice, defined restorative justice this way: an approach to achieving justice that involves those who have a stake in a specific offense to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. Here's a simpler way to put that. Restorative justice is bringing justice and healing to everyone involved in a harmful offense. So this is very different than Western colonial justice, which emphasizes assigned blame and retribution. Within the restorative justice community, there's talk about coming up with a wider concept, something even wider or broader than restorative justice. Could we call it relational justice, community justice, integrative justice, holistic, regenerative, moral, spiritual, or transformative justice? Because the highest justice would want to do more than restore what was originally there. It would want to somehow bring about improvement. It's like saying there's no sense in having problems if we don't learn from them and make the system better. Okay, one last slide is just a glimpse of some of the things, resources we have today and some thinking about the future of justice. We have this amazing document that Eleanor Roosevelt helped put together called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 articles. And when you read them, it can bring you to tears because you realize the world falls very short of those human rights. There's also the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, 46 incredibly thoughtful articles. There's something called virtue jurisprudence, which to me is very, very powerful. The idea that law should promote the development of virtuous character and justice should cultivate excellence among citizens. Wow. So that's bringing the highest moral values or virtues into the justice realm. Omniculturalism is the view that we should focus on what human beings have in common before we pay too much attention to our differences. And our differences are important, but we should start on common ground. Eco-justice is the idea that the earth and all living things should be part of the system of justice. And global justice, as people think about it today, would mean everyone being subject to the same rights and responsibilities. This would be the basis of global governance with international cooperation for the common good, bringing reduction and elimination of pain and suffering to the world. So it's a very lofty thing we're studying. Okay, let's go back to the gallery view. And I'd like to just call on people, if you're willing to introduce yourself, like say your name and what and where you live, very briefly, name and where you live, and what made you want to take this course. Rachel, can I prevail upon you to go first?
Sure. My name is Rachel Jones. I live in East Vancouver. I'm the managing director of the Living Interfaith Sanctuary, which is sponsoring this course from Harold. So we've worked with Harold before on other courses, and we're very excited about this one on justice. And I'm also involved in the restorative justice movement here in Vancouver. So it's exciting for me to be part of this.
Rachel is a tremendous resource for us. We wouldn't be here without her. Okay, Heidi, can you introduce yourself if you're willing?
Oh gosh, I'm Heidi Schmidt, and I live in West Vancouver. And my interest in justice is the injustices around the world, whether they be political, economic, environmental, social, you name it. It's really quite a task that we have ahead of us.
Thank you, Heidi. Raj, you willing to introduce yourself? Yeah, you're muted right now.
I'm Roz Latwala from Gold River on Vancouver Island. It's a fairly remote community. I appreciate all the research and knowledge that this course is presenting. I think it's kudos, to those people who have put it together. And the idea of forgiveness as a religious, I don't know, religious virtue, maybe, I want to know how that fits into the concept of justice.
Justice and mercy go together. Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah, let me call on people. Elaine, you willing to unmute and introduce yourself? Maybe not. I won't.
Yes. Hi,
Okay,
hi
there.
there, Harold. I just love the way you put this presentation together, and especially towards the last where you opened up all those deep and rich and various themes that flow through the theme of justice. I can't stay today, but I look forward to everything that follows. And I must say that until I entered the Baha'i faith, it didn't occur to me that justice could be like this amazing flower. Baha'u'llah talks about hyacinths of wisdom. And now I see there are hyacinths of justice that have so many things within them. So carry on. I look forward to being with you next time.
It's a global concept, an historical concept. You know, justice has a very rich history. That's what we're trying to get a glimpse of in this course. Okay, Nivi or Tani, willing to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Tani Nabea. I'm in Quinte, West Ontario, and I joined because I reconnected with Harold after 14 years about his book, Founders of Faith, which is promoting understanding of other religions and building an interfaith community. And I'm from a Hindu background, but brought up in school in a Christian community and worked in 3 different Islamic nations. And so I've had exposure to living under various codes of values. And I find there's something to learn from a value from each one. And you see a lot of unity between them. So and now I accept the Baha'i faith as my faith because it embraces them all. And Baha'u'llah says that this is the day of justice. And so we have it within our means to establish justice and world peace if we have the will. So I want to be part of the process.
Thank you, Tani. Okay, Bob, Charlie, are you willing to introduce yourself? You can pass. Perfect freedom to pass. Okay, Greg, you willing to introduce yourself? Greg
I sure
Dooley?
am, Harold. My name is Greg Dooley. I live in South Surrey. I've been interested in, well, concerned about the lack of the deterioration of social trust around the world, and I think justice is something that can be a bedrock or a normative framework for rebuilding social trust. I also have an interest in justice as it applies to environmental and ecological concerns. So I'm looking very much forward to it, and I found what you've said so far very, very enriching. Thank you very much, Harold.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, Nancy, willing to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nancy from Campbell River on the island, on Vancouver Island. And yeah, just very, very much interested in justice and how we can come together and apply it in today's fraught world.
Yes, you're on Vancouver Island. So am I, Ladysmith.
Oh, not too
Hey,
far.
yeah, Bev, Trinity Community Lutheran Church.
Bev Marr, I've got interfaith interests and am a minister of sorts, bridging really from the Christian through the Lutheran, but really a community church. And my ignorance is so great that I'm just opening myself up to more. And you know, I want to see the time of peace on earth come, and there will be no peace without justice. And so that brought me in, but to go through these slides, it just makes it more tangible to me. And I'm hoping some of these concepts will flow through me into my community.
No peace without justice. I think we should make a bumper sticker that says that. I think I've even
Sure
seen
there is
that.
one.
Yeah, I think there is one. Okay, Michelle, willing to introduce yourself, and then Dan.
Sure. So actually it was Heidi who gave me the information about this course, and I'm here, I think, out of curiosity and learning. And I'm interested in relationality and how community interacts with one another. I'm really taken by the work of like Joanna Macy and the great turning, unraveling, and how that applies to faith and justice. So yeah, looking forward to insight.
Glad you're here. Okay, Dan and then Dorothy. Dan.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Meilink. I am from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm a little bit further away than most of you. Justice and this course is kind of part of my continuing efforts to try to understand God and to try to understand what God means to me. And it's particularly interesting. I don't know, Harold, if you've ever heard him, but Stephen Greenbaum once said in a discussion, when we were talking about God as creator, God as overseer, God as helper, he said in his mind, God is justice. That's what he considers God to be. And so yeah, it's pretty central to what I'm after. And there's one other thing going on right now that none of you have mentioned, but I'm sure you're all aware of, and that is my country just decided to follow a new type of leadership and direction that doesn't fit with my concept of justice at all. And I'm trying to get a handle on how I personally proceed with my view of justice in a country that has said those things aren't important.
Thank you, Dan. My goodness, in this course, we're going to look at ideologies as concepts of justice. So, for example, fascism is a concept of justice. Nationalism is a concept of justice. Communism is a concept of justice. So some of the concepts of justice, we might say, are absolute evil, depending on our point of view. But we're kind of try to look at different concepts of justice and wherever the chips fall regarding them. But we're balancing the whole thing by looking at history as a whole, including what seem to be the very highest concepts of justice. Okay, Dorothy and then Sue. Oh, you're muted.
I'm
There you
trying.
go.
I'm trying. I am turned this way because I fell yesterday, whacked my head, and today, can you see this other eye? It's all back. But anyways, one of the things that you said, and it struck a wonderful, all of it did, Harold, but that heaven loves the whole world universally. And that sticks very close to my heart. And I really do look forward to it. I've known you as a great teacher, and I want to be here to learn. And that's why I'm here. Thank you very, very much.
Welcome back, Dorothy. Okay, Sue.
I'm Sue from Langley, and I'm a Baha'i. And so what resonated with me is what Heidi said, like, you look at the world now and it seems like justice has gone out the window. And so then we think, what can we do locally in our own communities to build justice? I think Baha'is are supposedly building vibrant communities where justice is going to work at a local level. And if it works at a local level, maybe it'll spread to a national and world level. So yeah, no, and I have a devotional tonight and the topic is justice. So Harold, you're giving me lots of information. So thank you.
Food for thought. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Okay, friends, I want to touch on a few more things in the handout. It's delightful to hear where you're coming from, and I'm going to occasionally, talk a while and then I'll stop and I say, please share your comments, observations, complaints, questions, experience. I think, we have a lot of different life experience, all of us together. And so I'm hoping you're going to bring important things to the table. I want to mention, I gave you on page 2 of the handout for today some sources. I just want to mention 5 of those. There's about 30 of them there, but I just want to mention a few. Payam Akavan wrote, In Search of a Better World. And that was part of the Massey lectures. And it's an incredible look at some of the biggest problems that we face in terms of world justice or the global court. Also, Danielle Allen wrote Justice by Means of Democracy. And that book, if you just read the introduction or the prologue and the first chapter, it would really do you a lot of good, I believe. There's a book, look at McCaslin, Wanda McCaslin. She's the editor of Justice as Healing, Indigenous Ways. Wow, there's a very thoughtful set of essays about justice from various indigenous perspectives. And by indigenous, I mean North American. It goes all over different parts of Canada and the US. Indigenous people are really bringing some very important, concepts to the table of justice, I believe. That expression, the meek shall inherit the earth? I've always interpreted that as indigenous people or the oppressed will inherit the earth because they'll bring their profound wisdom to the table if we can set up a justice system which listens to them. Okay, here's another one. Amartya Sen wrote The Idea of Justice. That's a very big book, about 800 pages. But again, if you read the prologue or the introduction and the first chapter, he outlines the system that he's proposing. He's basically saying we can start from the bottom up. A lot of concepts of justice have been from the top down, and we can work with, healing immediate atrocities, right? Build from the ground up in our theorizing about what justice actually is. He quoted Martin Luther King saying, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So it's working from the anywhere or all the local cases of injustice upward. And then the book by the Universal House of Justice, that's the highest body in the Baha'i faith. They wrote a 25-page paper called To the Peoples of the World, a Baha'i statement on peace, but it also touches on global justice. Peace, justice, and unity are, of course, highly interrelated. Friends, I want to alight on just a few other terms. On the 3rd page, about 2/3 of the way down, I threw out this term, virtue jurisprudence. It was also there in the slideshow. But virtue jurisprudence, the view that law should promote the development of virtuous character and justice should cultivate excellence among citizens, as well as flourishing in societies and the global community. I want to relate that virtue justice to 2 other ethical concepts. I once studied and had to teach at the University of Idaho the history of ethics. And basically in the West, you learn that there are 2 big systems of ethics. One is from Immanuel Kant, the idea, look on page 4, I summarize this a little bit. There's something called duty or obligation ethics. Duty or obligation. So when you study ethics in the West, you learn that there's 2 big choices. Duty and obligation ethics is one choice. Utilitarian and benefiting ethics is another. So I tried to define these as well as I could. Quickly, the duty ethic says you should act only on rules or maxims that can be universalized. That's the only kind of rules we should act on, the ones that can be universalized or applied to all people. Now, another point of view is this utilitarian point of view. They say, act to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. The greatest good for the greatest number. So there you're emphasizing results or benefits, not so much principles of obligation. Okay, So I grew up with this notion that there's only two systems of ethics, one of those two. You either have to choose one or the other or combine them in some way. I was always uncomfortable. I thought there was more to ethics than that. But look at virtue, relational ethics. That's on the 1/3 of the way down on page 4. Cultivating beautiful character, considering higher aspirations of humanity more than duties and benefits. The central principle of virtue ethics is act to cultivate virtue in oneself, in others, and in society as a whole. It's very interesting to me that women have been involved in the formulation of virtue ethics more than men. That doesn't surprise me. But I think virtue ethics is a way of rounding out the other two types of ethics. And there's starting to be lawyers that think we need to rethink all of law based on this concept of virtue. Characteristics of moral, spiritual value that are capacities that human beings have. So that would really reshape the legal system if that happened. That's what virtue jurisprudence is. Trying to rethink law and justice in terms of virtues or qualities like love, compassion, mercy, someone mentioned, justice itself, service, peace, etc. Okay. Also on page 4, about halfway down, is a concept called golden ages. When I look at world history, it strikes me that there are certain times when we got closer to justice than other times. So when did humanity actually get close to implementing justice on a wide scale? That's, to me, a very important question. And it helps you overcome depression. And you might say, oh, there's no way we can have justice. Well, sometimes we almost had it, right? So a golden age, I define it here, a period of sustained cultural development and refinement, usually from 1 to 3 centuries in duration, expressing religious and spiritual vision of a civilization at its awe-inspiring best. There's a simple way to put it. The leaders of golden ages, or the rulers, were patrons of learning. That has happened in the Tang dynasty in China. We'll mention this when we look at other sections. The Tang dynasty in China was a case of justice prevailing. The Gupta dynasty in India was another big case of justice prevailing. Under Ashoka, India saw another time of justice. Under Darius the Great and Cyrus the Great in Persia, you had a system of very widespread justice. Okay, under, I believe, David and Solomon, that's as close as Israel ever got to a just society, a flourishing society. So under Islam, in the Abbasid Empire, and in some of the centuries in Spain, there was an Islamic civilization that actually administered justice. So I think, and these are not well emphasized in Western history, right? Western history is Eurocentric and hasn't paid enough attention to justice as it has developed in other parts of the world. Okay, I've given you a bunch of terms, religious terms, because I'm assuming the highest concepts of justice have come from religion. That's what I think I see when I look at history objectively. And then I gave you something on page 6. I call it historic threats to justice and generic responses. So most of these terms are extremely important here. They're describing what went wrong and then what did humanity do in response. For example, the idea of the divine right of kings. Now, that was once a concept of justice, and it was so regularly abused that people said, we got to do something about that. So I put constitutional monarchy right under it. So I considered the divine right of kings as a problem that was addressed by constitutional monarchy. We'll take a look at that, especially in session 5 and 6. Okay, and then the next set of terms here. Slavery. as a problem, the solution to which was abolition of slavery, oppression as a problem, colonialism as a problem, liberation as the name of the response to those forms of injustice, if they were forms of injustice. I realize I'm carrying assumptions with me. Look at patriarchy. I consider that a problem. That means that women were oppressed through much of recorded human history. And gradually, women started to gain their rights. Okay, so I'm calling women's suffrage was a response to patriarchy. Autocracy, you could consider that a problem, a form of government in which one ruler has absolute control and decision-making power. A major response to autocracy is democracy, which is difficult to define, but I tried to here. Governance by consent of the governed through elected representatives, an attempt to form a relatively egalitarian and pluralistic society that optimizes individual opportunity for advancement and social progress, an alternative to autocratic, oligarchic, and monarchic forms of government, a constitutional system aiming to balance legislative, executive, and judicial powers. So there you have a rather long definition of democracy, which I got from studying a lot of different sources. And democracy is a response to autocracy. And that battle goes on today, right? As some of you have noticed, not just south of the border, but in other parts of the world. And then I give you a whole bunch of terms, all of which I consider bad. Ideology, nationalism, fascism, communism, capitalism, technocracy, Islamism. These are ideologies. And again, ideology might be considered neutral. You could use the term ideology neutrally to mean your worldview, period. But often the reason world ideology is somewhat negative to me is because it claims to be all-encompassing. It makes an absolute claim. For example, in China, I would say the operative ideology is nationalism. Now, you could say it's communism, but I think there are two very powerful ideologies operating in China. But I would say nationalism is the higher of the two. When push comes to shove, China said, "Oh, we're going to have a Chinese type of communism, not a Russian type," right? So nationalism was actually a little bit higher on the values list. Anyway, this is only my observation, but I'm describing ideologies there of different types as something that's been a challenge for justice. They were a claim to be just, and then in retrospect, it looks like they fell short of that high standard. Okay, and down below I put other terms, prejudice and discrimination. Look at this definition of prejudice: unfavorable judgment about members of a group and exclusion of them without accurate knowledge of the group's nature, nor any substantial contact with its members. This attitude of prejudice and this behavior violates norms of rationality and ethics. So prejudice is almost the opposite of justice, right? In fact, all of these might be considered that, the problems. I have a tendency to underline in red the things that are bad and underline in green the things that are good. So I have more red underlines on this page than any other kind. Racism, discriminating for one's own cultural group against others due to arrogance, ignorance, or fear. This practice is an abuse of power and a violation of basic human rights. Okay, partisanism, I consider that bad. The view that adversarial groups are utterly necessary in a political system. And partisanism means alignment with one such group and conflict with all the other groups. That's what partisanism is. And I'm only sharing my point of view. You can have a different one. That's quite all right. I list some other things that are bad: vices, corruption, which is dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, typically involving bribery, backbiting, homicide or murder, aggression, war. These are all the problems that justice has to address. On
Harold,
the next,
someone
yes,
has their
please.
hand up.
Oh,
Tani, is it that your first name, Nevaeh?
Yeah, Tani Nivea. I go by Nivea mostly, but Harold knows me from a long time ago as Tani. Anyway, I put it in a comment on the chat here. Just when you said that prejudice is an unfavorable opinion about a group, and I want to add to that that it can also be another type of bias of overgeneralizing that a particular group has favorable qualities, as in, people thinking that the white race is superior overall all people. So I think in both ways, it's an
yes.
overgeneralization. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Toddy. I skipped over fascism there, but that would be an extreme form of that type of prejudice that you just described. It seems to me authoritarian, ultra-nationalist ideology and form of government suppressing opposition, believing there's one master race, or something like that. Anyway, we take a look at that in section 6, or rather session 6 in this whole series. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. So anyway, I just put this initial session is about overall terms, and I gave you a glimpse of the periods of history that we're looking at, the systems or ideas of justice. I'm just trying to get everyone to think in a different way about justice. A lot of people think about justice for me. That's one concept of justice, right? Justice for me, or justice for my family, or justice for my religion, or justice for my ethnic group. What about justice for everyone? What about justice for not only human beings, but for the earth itself and the whole environment? So there are different circles that come to bear in considerations of what justice is. And it helps to kind of look at what humanity's done in the past, what has been the guidance we tried to implement, and how did we fall short. Okay, I also have a section in the notes on page 7, global, historical, and sequential concepts. That's simply putting in words what the slideshow was trying to say. It lists all those highest concepts of justice that we got from different parts of the world, going way, way back.
Harold, Nevaeh has another comment.
Yeah, your hand is up. Tani, yeah.
Sorry, I was writing it in the chat again, but when you were going over the summary of justice concepts at the beginning from all the different faiths and civilizations, so many times it came up that that a system of justice was in order to establish sort of like God's rule on earth, virtue on earth. And I wondered if, how many of those, I didn't count them, but I wondered how much justice is dependent on like conflict, like resolving conflict. Is that the motivation for establishing justice, or can you have interest in justice without conflict in order to have a divine civilization? So I just wondered what you thought about that.
That's an extremely important question. In other words, is the motivation for justice negative or positive? Is our motivation to overcome an atrocity, or is it to please God or please ultimate reality? You might say, it's fascinating. The guy who wrote that book that I mentioned, In Search of a Better World, the Massey Lectures, the guy who worked for the World Court, Hayam Akavan, he was saying we really can't be committed to justice until our heart is broken with suffering and injustice. So that, I think he's saying we have to really have felt injustice to care about justice. My experience is different than that. I don't say he's wrong. So, a one powerful motivation for caring about justice is injustice, your own personal suffering. However, I'm more philosophical. I've always been looking at what is the biggest idea possible and where did that come from? It looks to me like all the ideas of justice ultimately had a religious source. They were from a higher dimension of reality. That dimension is named differently. Sometimes it's polytheistic system like Thoth and Ma'at. Sometimes it's the high God, the highest of the high gods is the one who administers justice. I think in the West we think of divine law as the highest law, that we fall short of. So this is you're just asking the question of the whole course. How do we conceive of it? I think we can be driven to it by our local experience of pain. And we can be driven to it for a higher, you might say, philosophical or religious motivation. We want to know what it's all about.
Or
What is it all
consciousness,
about?
higher consciousness.
Yeah, both higher consciousness. Yeah.
Do you, and this, the aside of that is like if humans are trying to, aspire to be God-like and search out God and what his plan and purpose for us is here on earth, and that drives the need for a system of justice. I just wondered, like, that's a human quality, and how much is justice? What evidence is there of justice in the animal world? I mean, is this an evolution of our consciousness, or is there justice in the animal world too?
I wish my wife were on this particular Zoom call because she read a couple of books about this. There are things that look like ethical systems among animals, right? Chimpanzees or dogs and cats. And so I think some people would like to say, look at it from the bottom up. It's possible to look at justice from the bottom up. That is to say, the material world. And you can look at it from the top down too, right? So both. In other words, let's say, and to me, those are not contradictory. If reality is something that's both material and spiritual, which I think is true, it's both material and spiritual. That's why we can look at justice from the bottom up or the physical realm up, including the biological realm up, and from the top down, from the highest concepts and locating their source, their revelatory source, if we believe in revelation or in Dharma or in the mandate of heaven. I love to study highest concepts and see how they're correlated. Okay, Michelle, your hand is up, please. Yeah.
Well, just you mentioned that you're a Unitarian minister, and in terms of where that fits in, and some Unitarians being non-theists, or but justice being such a crucial part of Unitarian Universalism, how to reconcile that non-theism and emphasis on justice. And I also wanted to raise Gaianism as well, as in terms of a something to worship.
Excellent. I was a Unitarian minister from 1975 to the year 2000, so 25 years. And for the last 25 years, I've been a Baha'i, but I like to believe I've carried my Unitarian Universalism with me. Yes, as a Unitarian, I was very aware that people had very different points of view. Humanistic, atheistic, spiritually oriented, liberal Christians, were all welcome. People who revered the earth had a Gaian point of view. I see, when I look at world history, I don't make a big distinction between, let's say, theism and polytheism and humanism. I see a continuity in those views rather than, I emphasize, the both and or continuum nature of reality. That's how I see it. You know, for example, in Egypt, they had, okay, polytheism is what they call it, but there was the high gods had more influence than the lower gods, right? There's still a hierarchy. And Ma'at and Thoth were way up there as arbiters of justice and ones who prepared you for eternal life, a very high portfolio. So, you know, when people say they don't believe in God, that means they believe probably in the material world and in science and in reason. And if you follow the higher dictates of reason, that can lead you all the way up to ultimate reality, right? So humanists and theists and different kinds of believers can get on the same page. This is my main point. My main approach to different kinds of courses, that all views are welcome and we should look for common ground. Okay, Roz, your hand is up, please.
Back to the question of do we react negatively or do we have this innate sense? I've been involved with children for a long, long time, and they have, I know, an innate sense of justice. They know right away when their rights are being violated, and it isn't from us teaching them. They just know this. So for me, I think as human beings, we are born with that kind of innate sense. And we get discouraged when it doesn't work for us and we get, pushed aside or whatever happens. But for me, it is part of being human, part of being born. We don't have to react too negative to understand justice. We've got it in our hearts somehow when we're here. So that was my contribution.
Absolutely.
Watch
So
the
in other
children.
words, yeah, there's plenty of evidence that that there's a built-in concept of justice, right? Plenty of evidence. And then there's external influences on that. You could say all of the world religions are external influences. They're saying, yes, I know you have a little bit of justice within you, but here's some details on how to be just. You know, I noticed that was a big issue among Chinese thinkers. To what extent is our concept of justice innate? And Confucius came out very strongly that it was innate, right? And needed to be cultivated. So he emphasized education quite a bit and propriety. And there were other, Chinese thinkers. We're going to look at them in session 3. Han Fei said, we have to be controlled by the state. People are greedy. People are selfish. They don't have a very well-developed sense of justice, so it needs to be imposed on them with a very strong legal system. There have to be very negative consequences for breaking laws. Oh, so it's fascinating to me that when we look at China, we'll see how they had a wide range of views on human nature, right? But I think personally, I agree with you. We have innate capacity for justice. And I have to quickly add, it needs to be cultivated by parents, by religion, by education, by the way society is structured. To me, virtue jurisprudence would be the type of legal system that actually thinks about cultivating higher morality and flourishing in human society, encouraging people to make positive contributions to the world, and to see a legal problem as an opportunity for transformation. So using, in other words, restorative justice as a technique to a future, more evolved justice system. Anyway, okay, we don't have much time left. Anyone else want to say something that you were thinking of it and didn't quite get a chance? Let me mention a few more things. In the handout, near the end is a timeline. Well, that timeline is only a sneak preview of session 6, which is going to look at the history of international law. And the history of international law is what many people think of as this whole topic, right? Justice means how did we develop a system of international law? But that's a Eurocentric way of looking at it. You know, in the 16th century, European nations, because they had so many boats, started to dominate the world. And so the colonial concepts of justice emerged as what most people think of as that's the history of international justice. Well, I want us to look at international justice differently by first immersing ourselves in other parts of the world other than Europe. So that's why we're going to do indigenous concepts of justice next week, and some of the older ones like the Mesopotamian and the Egypt, starting out with indigenous and older views, then going over to India and seeing and China, India and China in the third session, looking at their concepts of justice, which are deep and profound and pervasive. And then looking at another thing that's been overlooked in the West, ancient Persia and Islam, looking at them at their best. What kind of justice systems did they evolve? They're stunning. They're amazing. You know, the whole idea of an empire or imperial justice was, I think, invented by the ancient Persians. We'll look at that when we look at session 4. I think you'll see what I mean. A lot of ideas about justice came from there, but the West didn't like to admit it. The West would say, oh, we got this from Greece and Rome. It has nothing to do with Persia. Well, I think it's a much more complex picture than that. And especially now, we're free to roam all over the world, right? We've roamed all over the world in this session. And in your study, and your, checking out websites, you can look at things globally now. It's possible. Okay. Anything else for the good of the order?
Yeah, I was just putting it in the chat again. I have this question. I was asking, will you be addressing how to implement the rulings of international law, as in our International Court of Justice in The Hague? Because,
less so. Yeah, I hear what you're asking. The how to. So this course is mostly a history of ideas. I think action is implied, what you can always ask, what kind of action would be implied by an idea? But we're mostly studying in this course, the history of the ideas of justice. But things that were done to implement it, we're going to look at those legal systems, right? Certain institutions have arisen to respond to a sense of justice. An ancient example was this Ashoka. He says, Buddha teaches that we're supposed to overcome suffering. So guess what? We're actually going to look at suffering. We're going to study it. And we're going to figure out what can be done about it. He called them Dharma officers. Imagine that your goal is to go somewhere, check out several villages and count and document all the suffering in those villages and say, and then answer the question, what can be done to alleviate the suffering of the animals, of the children, of the people of all ages? How can we address it? Okay.
Can I add to that example, Harold, that for the people who aren't familiar with Ashoka in India, that he only came to Buddhism and established all those wonderful, noble ideas after being sort of the Indian version of Alexander the Great. In other words, he was a very ferocious warrior who tried to conquer brutally as many little kingdoms all over India as possible. And it was only when he came to my state in India, where the very simplest of people picked up the very simplest of tools, knew they didn't have a chance, but fought anyway, that he was inspired by their nobility of character, that they were fighting for their sense of justice, even though they knew they were going to fail. That was his transformational point. So he didn't start out as a good guy.
No, he was a conqueror. You know, here's another interesting fact. That guy Mo Tzu, I think, Dorothy, you liked what Mo Tzu said. He said, heaven loves the whole world universally. But guess who Mo Tzu was at first? He was a conqueror. And he noticed something. He says, you know, war does not really solve too many problems. We need another approach to solving problems. And he started to analyze what would love look like if more and more people had it, if love applied to wider circles. So he ended up saying universal love is what must be implemented in order to overcome conflict. So there's another conqueror who was converted to another point of view. Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah, Ashoka and Motsu ended up, producing very lofty systems, of service and thought, but starting from a militaristic base. Very, very interesting. Okay, friends, we've run out of real estate. I think, yeah, I'm going to observe the time carefully. We're only going to do 90 minutes. That's as much as people can handle by Zoom. You turn into a pumpkin after that. All right, in 2 weeks, I think we come back in 2 weeks, and I'm going to send you a handout that's about 7 or 8 pages on these indigenous concepts of justice, plus a little bit more on Egypt and Mesopotamia too, and Africa, right? So we're looking at ancient and indigenous concepts of justice, and that will be our first antidote to Eurocentrism. We're going to try to overcome Eurocentrism in 3 sessions. Next session, and then the one after that, looking at India and China, and the one after that, looking at Persia and the Middle East. Those should cure us of Eurocentrism. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.